Afternoon, and welcome to another of our Swift web forums. Glad to have you here with us. We have a very interesting topic for you today. It's on Moses, and it will be from the perspective of the Christian, Islamic, and Jewish religions. And I'm sure there's many interesting questions that you will hear, and a lively discussion. And one of those may be, who knows, would Moses have chosen the person that played him in the Ten Commandments? I'm being told that's not going to be one of our discussion questions. Sorry about that, but let's go on. Now, for our next part, I'm going to talk a little bit about Swift. Now, those of you that have heard all this before, go ahead, get some tea, get something to nosh on. Give me about 2 minutes and then come on back, okay? For those that are new to Swift, just a little bit about Swift here. We are an interfaith group and we meet once a month. And our goal is to promote interfaith understanding. We do not debate, we don't discuss politics. We're just here to help people understand each other. There are 19 congregations that are members of Swift, and we do a number of things. Pre-COVID, we had 2 dinners that were excellent. We would have discussions, and hopefully we will get back to those and see many of you again at that time. We had 2 forums a year that were live. The advantage to the forums being live, of course, it's always nice to have a face-to-face interaction. The other advantage to having, though, these forums online is that if you get tired of hearing me, you can mute me. You can't do that at a live forum. So we hope to get back to those after COVID, and everyone is safe. We do many other things. We do many service projects. We've worked cleaning up the woods. Our last previous one was at the Cook County Forest Preserve, where we went and helped to clean up there, and that was also interfaith. Again, when we're all able to meet, there's an interfaith picnic at the end of the year. We have home dinners. We have contributed money to some of the local food pantries. So we're quite involved and an excellent group to be in. And that about sums up for Swift. So I hope some of you have come back now. I hope you got your cup of coffee or whatever you're noshing on. And next we'd like to go to a prayer that is going to be said by one of our Swift board members, Ernie Radowitz. Ernie?
Okay, all right. It's going to be 2 parts of the prayer. Let me start. Teach us to give thanks for what we have by sharing it with those who are in need. Keep our eyes open to the wonders of creation and alert to the care of the earth. May we never be lazy in the work of peace. May we honor those who have died in defense of our ideals. Grant our leaders wisdom and forbearance. May they govern with justice and compassion. Help us all to appreciate one another, to respect the many ways that we may serve you. May our homes be safe from affliction and our country be sound in body and spirit. And since we're going to be talking about Moses, let me offer a prayer of his. Elna, please God, Rafana Lanu, cure us. And I think that's appropriate to our time right now.
Thank you, Ernie. We are going to next, I'm going to introduce you to another Swift board member, Amy, and Amy Shaban will be talking about the rules under which the discussion will take place. So we do have very definite rules and time limits, and now Amy is going to cover this. Amy?
A very warm welcome to our esteemed speakers. Swift is very pleased to have each of you sharing your expertise and experiences. Each speaker will be given 20 minutes and will be notified of the remaining time at 5 minutes, at 2 minutes, and when your time is up. The time for each speaker will be monitored by our MC, Ray. So keep an eye on that. Our forums are designed for compassionate learning from each other. Thus, no debate or politics will be a part of this forum. Speakers, please remember to keep your mic muted and your video off until it's your turn to speak. Our first speaker is Rabbi Michael Belinsky. He is Executive Vice President of the Chicago Board of Rabbis and is a member of the Jewish Catholic Scholars Dialogue in Chicago. He's also on the board of the Parliament of the World Religions and serves as an executive of the Council of Religious Leaders in Metropolitan Chicago. Welcome, Rabbi Belinsky.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. And certainly, unfortunately, we can't do this in person. But because we're on Zoom, I also have the opportunity to join you today as I'm visiting grandchildren in Washington, D.C. So this provides a chance still for us to be together, and whatever and the difficulties COVID has presented to us, certainly Zoom has been at least certainly a sign of blessing within it. So I'm very happy to be here. Just one very minor correction on my bio. I was the Executive Vice President of the Chicago Board of Rabbis. I actually retired 2 years ago, though the rest of everything that was said was certainly accurate, and I certainly still have a very loving relationship with the Board of Rabbis. So within the time frame, I want to share a series of thoughts within the context of Jewish tradition on Moses. We certainly cannot do a complete biography or certainly deal with every source there. And we see this in, I think, all three of our traditions. There's a tremendous amount of material on Moses contained within our sacred text, as well as within our interpretive text. But I do want to highlight a few areas and a few points, and I very much look forward to hearing from my co-panelists and also certainly from questions and comments during that period. So first of all, within Jewish tradition, Moses, and often referred to and understood within Jewish tradition, is people will speak of him not so much as prophet Moses, although he certainly was a prophet and is considered the greatest of the prophets, but very much Moses within Jewish tradition is referred to in Hebrew as Moshe, the Hebrew version of the name Moses, as Moshe Rabbeinu. Moses, our master, Moses, our teacher, Moses, our rabbi. And so within the context of Jewish tradition, the greatness of Moses is from his capacity as transmitter, receiver and transmitter of Torah and tradition, of mitzvot, commandments, and he takes on the status as really being viewed as the first rabbi, as the first one of the rabbinic tradition. Now, Moses may receive certainly Torah from God and transmit them to the people, but certainly Moses also, even within the context and understanding of Jewish rabbinic tradition, adds to that tradition as well, even as he transmits it. So if we look at a 3rd century text, it begins as follows, and it's a beginning of a series of texts, but it says as follows: Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, was the leader following Joshua. Joshua transmitted it to the elders transmitted it to the prophets then transmitted it to the great men of the Great Assembly, and then it continues listing the order of transmission, continuing down to the rabbis of the Talmudic period of about 1700 years ago. And so this sense of Moses as first Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our rabbi, our teacher, we find even within some understandings of the first 5 books of the Bible, which are known as the 5 books of Moses, also known as the Torah, and particularly contains within them both the sense, particularly within the first 4 books, the Moses transmitting the revelation of God, received at Sinai, and then continuing through the 40 years of Moses's leadership, wandering through the desert until they were to get to the promised land, and Moses passes away just before they get there. But the Torah also contains the fifth book of the Torah, the book of Deuteronomy, which is considered by some to be the first book of oral tradition. In other words, the Torah is our written tradition. It's the written Torah containing what we have, but that the book of Deuteronomy, although later certainly written and becomes part of the written Torah, but that it originally emerged not as revelation from God, but as Moses's understanding and transmission, originating with Moses. And if you look at the book of Deuteronomy, recounting that which had taken place over the previous 40 years, and that these words, which are originally Moses, are then considered, when they become part of the book of Deuteronomy, to be given a divine imprimatur, a divine legitimacy. And so what we have with Moses is someone who is both the transmitter of the Torah, what becomes known in Jewish tradition as written Torah, later on into the Bible, the 5 books of Moses, but also as the first rabbi passing on, originating some of the oral tradition, which becomes the foundation of the rabbinic tradition, of the process of understanding, interpreting, and reading the written Torah. It becomes the interpretive tradition, and as well as adding on new laws that are instituted as time goes on, certainly relating to new traditions and the like. So that the importance of Moses is the first rabbi of the rabbinic tradition, who transmits and teaches Torah, which for the rabbinic tradition, the teaching of Torah becomes critical. And the teaching of Torah, which takes on not only the transmission of the Torah, but also takes on elements of the personality of the person teaching, that too with Moses, as we see in the book of Deuteronomy. So this is the first point I want to make, that the greatness of Moses is that he is our master, our teacher, our rabbi, our transmitter, our interpreter, and teacher of God's word. All right, so that's point number 1. Point number 2. Moses is the one who leads the fight against Pharaoh, as described in the book of Exodus, to end slavery and release the Jewish people from bondage. Moses is absolutely vital to this process. But what's interesting within Jewish tradition is that ultimately the redemption is attributed to God, and the role of Moses, although absolutely clear within the Bible, within the book of Exodus, it's absolutely clear to read about it, and the story of the plagues and the miracles that he wrought. But what's striking is when it comes to the Jewish holiday of Passover, which celebrates the liberation from Egypt, which celebrates the exodus from Egypt, the Passover Seder, which is done at night, when families gather and generations gather to tell the story of the Exodus, what is very striking is that Moses is absent from that story. And for the Passover Seder, which is celebrated, it is not at all about Moses's role in the redemption, but the emphasis on that night is the God taking the Jewish people out of Egypt. And so you have this sort of very striking situation in which a central figure of it is left out when the holiday is celebrated and the actual story is told in that ritual manner of telling it from generation to generation. Now, why that is the case could be because we want to emphasize God taking the people out of Egypt. A second possibility, which I have played with, is that Moses, despite his importance to the Exodus from Egypt, Moses is someone for whom the Torah is clear about, but we don't hear about Moses's children. And even during the first Passover Seder in Egypt, Moses's wife and children are not with him. They're back home with their father-in-law in Midian. And it's as if Moses is the redeemer, this important teacher, but he's not really for Jewish tradition within the role model of the family. And the family, which is so central to the Seder and transmission from generation within the context of the family to the next, Moses is absent from that. Moses is crucially important, but we never hear very much about Moses as father. And so perhaps that's maybe a reason why Moses is downplayed in the Seder, but he's certainly crucial in the Bible to the story of the Exodus from Egypt. Third element of Moses, which is critically important for Jewish tradition. Moses is the great defender of the Jewish people against God. After the revelation of God to the people at Mount Sinai, the Ten Commandments described in the book of Exodus, Moses goes up to the mountain for 40 days to receive the Torah, for it to be God inscribing it on tablets. But in Moses' absence, the people build a golden calf, an idol, which very much upsets God. And here is the description from the book of Exodus, chapter 32. It's just a few verses. Aaron, Moses' brother, said to the people who were clamoring and wondering, where is Moses? He's on the mountain. He hasn't come down. He's disappeared for almost 40 days, and they're terrified. So Aaron, in trying to delay them, says, take off the golden rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, and bring them to me. And all the people took the gold rings and brought them to Aaron. Then Aaron took them and cast them in a mold and made it into a molten calf. It becomes the golden calf. And the people exclaimed when they saw this, this is your God, who, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So suddenly the people see a calf and assume that's God, as opposed to the real God. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron announced, tomorrow shall be a festival for the Lord, perhaps trying to delay and waiting while Moses might come down the mountain. But he didn't. Early the next day, the people brought up burnt offerings and brought sacrifices, and they sat down to eat and drink, and they began to dance. And the Lord said to Moses, hurry down, for your people who you brought of this land have acted basely. They've turned away. They've made an idol. And then God says to Moses, I see this as a stiff-necked people. Now let me be, God says to Moses, that my anger may blaze forth against them, that God says I may destroy them and make of you, Moses, a great nation. Right? So God presents to Moses, let me destroy them and I'll begin again with you. But Moses implored the Lord God, saying, let not the anger of the Lord blaze forth against your people, whom you delivered from the land in Egypt with a great and mighty hand. Let not the Egyptians say he delivered them with an evil intent only to destroy them. Turn from your blazing anger, renounce the plan to punish your people. Remember your covenant, your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Israel, how you swore to them that you would make their offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and give them the land. And so Moses makes that argument to God. And then the Exodus continues, and the Lord renounced the punishment he had planned to bring upon his people. And if you look in the book of Exodus, if you pay careful attention, it's very interesting. God says to Moses initially, your people, Moses, have made this idol. And Moses's response to God is, no, they're your people. They're your people who you delivered from the land of Egypt. It's as if Moses reminds God, no, they're your people. You can't abandon them, even if they may have done something terribly wrong. And so Moses is remembered in Jewish tradition. We don't have time to go into some other examples of this, maybe during the questions, but he's someone who is the great defender of the Jewish people against God. He can be critical of them sometimes, but he is also the great defender of them against God. And that too is within Jewish tradition an important model for the rabbinic model to be the first rabbi. Moses is also the great iconoclast. Moses, when he comes down, even after God said he won't destroy the people, but when Moses comes down from Mount Sinai with the tablets, he smashes them and destroys them. And Exodus describes the tablets were the writing of God, so they're this really holy object. But as soon as Moses came near the camp, and he saw the golden calf and the people dancing around it, he became enraged, and he hurled the tablets from his hand and shattered them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf that they had made and burned it, ground it to powder, and strewed it upon the water, and then he made the Israelites drink it. Now again, Moses is holding the people accountable. Even as he has defended them against God, he is still holding them accountable. But he realizes
5 minutes.
Thank you. He realizes that sometimes you have to take what may even be the holiest object here, the tablets inscribed by God, and shatter them, lest they become also perhaps a possibility of idolatry, or they cannot stand at the same time there is idolatry. And indeed, in the last verse of the book of Deuteronomy, which just summarizes Moses's life, the last verse, he already had just died a couple of verses before, and Moses is remembered for all the great might and awesome power that Moses displayed before all of Israel. And one of the commentaries suggests, what was the great power Moses displayed before all of Israel? That he broke those tablets, that he knew when to be an iconoclast, and which God also agreed and said and gave to Moses an expression of thanks and congratulations because Moses broke them, even though they were the tablets of God. God even agreed with Moses, you have to know when certain things have to be shattered if it's going to represent a corruption of everything holy and pure. And finally, and I just have a couple of minutes, Moses, as I mentioned, within Jewish tradition, is certainly viewed also as a prophet, and certainly as the greatest of prophets. But there's one text I want to share with you from the rabbinic tradition. It said all of the prophets observed their prophecies through an obscured, hazy looking glass, the Hebrew word aspaklaria, which means their prophecies were given metaphoric visions, were not a direct perception of the matter. However, Moses, our master, observed his prophecies through a clear looking glass, which means he gained a direct and accurate perception of the matter. Now, we might think this means that the prophets, and some say they were dreaming when they prophesied, but that their prophecies, important, containing vital message, but still are not an actual vision of God. They are something which is obscure, hazy, that has their own element within them. Moses saw absolutely clearly, saw God perhaps face to face. But one of the commentaries, medieval commentaries on this rabbinic passage, explains it somewhat differently. He said, what does it mean when the prophets saw through an obscured looking glass? It meant they thought that they were actually seeing God. What does it mean that Moses looked through a clear looking glass? It means he knew he was not seeing God and unable to see God. And in that sense, if that's the interpretation, the greatness of the prophecy of Moses was his humility and clarity, that even as close as he was to God, he knew he could not really see God. Other prophets are great, but they made one mistake. Their prophecies contained important messages, but they thought they were actually seeing God. Moses understood with clarity that he had a message to bring and transmit from God, but that he could not see God. All right, so I think basically my time is up. I have one more, there was one more question we were given about modern day relevance, and I have some thoughts on that, but I can certainly be asked that during the questions as I don't want to go over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Belinsky. Our second speaker is Reverend Caleb Hong. Reverend Hong is lead pastor of Faith United Methodist Church in Orland Park and provides spiritual leadership and oversight of church leaders and the congregation. Caleb has served as a pastor since 1997 in Delaware, Georgia, and several congregations in Northern Illinois. His wife, Reverend Sarah Hong, serves Manuka United Methodist Church. Welcome, Reverend Hong.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for this invitation to be part of the Fall Speaker Forum for SWIFT. It's an honor always to be a part of this fellowship and to do the work that is so vital that we do together as a part of SWIFT. You know, just thinking about the topic at hand, my first thought when I heard today's topic about Moses was, duh, isn't this obvious? You know, Moses obviously looks and sounds just like Charlton Heston. Well, maybe y'all thought that too. Tall, strong, good looking, good hair. What else is there to know about Moses? And then I thought about it. When you think about Moses's life, I think one of the beauties of Moses's life is that we see so much of it from beginning to end. And so as I thought about Moses's life, I thought of some words that I might use to describe him. And I realized, again, there's more to the story. There's words such as orphan, prince, pauper, prophet, multicultural, bilingual or tri or many-lingual, insider, outsider, privileged, lawbreaker, murderer, lawgiver, meek, friend of God, one who knew God face to face, and one of the greatest prophets in history. I wanted to read from a segment of a book about Moses by Adam Hamilton. I like this, it's just a couple of paragraphs that I'll read, but it says this about Moses. Moses. He is the single most important figure in the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament. His presence is felt throughout the Christian New Testament. The epic account of his life, together with the deliverance of the Israelite slaves from bondage in Egypt, is the defining story of the Jewish people. The Jewish festivals of Sukkot, Shavuot, Passover, as well as the holy days of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, they're all rooted in Moses' story and the law attributed to him, as is the weekly observance of the Sabbath among Jews. For Christians, Moses' life serves as the backdrop for much that is found in the Gospels, including the story of Jesus' flight to Egypt, the Sermon on the Mount, many of Jesus' sayings in the Gospel of John, the activities of Jesus around Jerusalem, the Last Supper, the crucifixion, all of those connections. In the Gospel account of Christ's transfiguration, Moses actually appears to Jesus and speaks to him. Moses is mentioned by name more than 70 times in the New Testament, and his life story and commands are alluded to in nearly every New Testament book, which is to say, Moses has such a significant, such a humongous role in the Christian tradition. So I wanted to just give three categories of reflections when it came to Moses and his life and his impact from a Christian perspective. And the first is this: Moses offers a reflection of God's grace. Grace is unearned, it's unmerited, it is an undeserved gift. It's also foundational to Christian teaching and theology. And when you look at Moses's life, we see God's grace at work in every stage of Moses's life, early, middle, late. So in the early part of Moses's life, we see God's grace in the 4 women who loved and protected him. The first 2 were midwives who risked their lives to save Moses, as well as the other Hebrew boys. Shiphrah, Puah, these are midwives who disobeyed the direct order of Pharaoh. They risked imprisonment, they risked beatings, they risked even death to save Moses' life and these other boys' life. And also in these 2 midwives, in their example in life, we see an example of civil disobedience. Again, advocates for the powerless and the voiceless. The second woman who loved and protected Moses is his mother. So Moses' mother knew Pharaoh's command. She gave birth to Moses, and then she did everything she could to protect him. She cared for Moses for the first 3 months or so of his life, and then she did everything she could to love him beyond that, including giving him up. Now, I know this could be seen as heartless and harsh by some, but I think in some extreme cases, this is the most loving thing that a mother can do, to give birth to a child and then give that child up. Moses' mother, she just had this refusal. She had this refusal to let her son die. Again, so she hid him 3 months, and then she put him in a basket. She placed him in in the reeds and the Nile River at a location where Pharaoh's daughter was known to bathe. And this is the Bible's first story of adoption. Moses' mother gave up Moses for adoption in order to save his life, in order to preserve his life. There are people in my congregation, perhaps in yours, who have stories of adoption. I wanted to read one account of a woman who gave up her child, and wanted to share that with you. So she writes this: I gave up my firstborn for adoption 37 years ago. I was 23, alone and scared. While so very painful, mine is a beautiful story. I can say without hesitancy that even though the darkest days of my experience, being totally isolated from family and friends, I felt the hand of God cover me throughout my whole journey. I wanted to keep her, but I felt she should not have to do hard life because of me. She deserved better. I prayed daily that God would protect my daughter. Sometimes, years later, I would wake up in the middle of the night and she would be on my heart. 4 years ago, she found me. Her family is beautiful. They raised her to be a strong woman of faith. She thanked me for giving her life. She has a beautiful family of her own. I'm still sorry for any hurt that I caused her by the decision I made years ago, but I am forever grateful to God for watching over her and watching over me. Some of you here, even in this forum, may be adopted like Moses. Others of you may be like Moses's mother, and you've given up your child to adoption, not because you didn't care for your child, but because you loved your child and wanted your child to have a future with hope. In any case, I think there's, again, grace that we see in this part of Moses' story and his life. The fourth woman that I would point to in Moses' early part of life is Pharaoh's daughter. She's the woman who adopted Moses and invited Moses to be part of her life. She didn't have to. She could have ignored the crying baby in the reeds. She could have chosen and figured it's not her problem. Why make her life more complicated? But instead, she chose to be compassionate, to care for this child, to love and care and invite him into her life. I want us to notice that she did this in defiance of her father's orders. She adopted an abandoned child of an enslaved people. She adopted a child and brought into her home, into the Pharaoh's household, a child that was already condemned to death by her dad. When I think of Moses' early life, I think of children left on the steps of hospitals or of firehouses. I think of children left in desperation, but also in love on the steps of border patrol agents, like Moses, like Moses's mother. The question then that I wrestle with is, can I be like like Pharaoh's daughter, in the position of privilege that I have? Will I be courageous enough and compassionate enough? The middle stage of Moses's life, again, we see God's grace there too. Moses is around 80 years old. He's a late bloomer, apparently. And we see God's grace when Moses, this prince, and then fugitive, and then shepherd, becomes Moses, the leader and prophet. God's grace is especially evident, I think, at this stage in life when Moses has to confront Pharaoh. And Moses's confrontation with Pharaoh, I figure it's like David versus Goliath on steroids, because Moses, he was not only facing a giant seasoned warrior, Moses was facing the most powerful ruler on planet Earth. Moses was facing not only the most powerful ruler on earth, but the mightiest armies on the planet with chariots and many, many Goliaths. Without God, Moses had zero chance of victory. With God, Moses had 100% chance of victory. We go to the end stage of Moses's life, and this is in the last 40 years or so. Moses, his job is to lead this rebellious and stubborn people to wander, and actually he knows to die in the wilderness. This would be a very tough and discouraging job, I think, for any of us. Because of the people's rebellion and rejection of God and the promised land the first time around, we know that none of this generation, including Moses, would be allowed to step into the promised land. But even while the people are wandering in the wilderness, waiting to die, essentially, for 40 years, God's grace abounded in the daily provision of food and water, manna and quail, and protection from enemies. We see God's grace at work. And then at the end of his life, we're told that God led Moses up Mount Nebo and gave Moses this glimpse, this view of the promised land. So God, who is this friend of God, Moses, who is this friend of God and faithful follower of God, he's able to die with a sense of peace and hope, because he knows that there's something better ahead for the next generations. So in Moses's life, in the early, middle, late stage, kind of throughout Moses's life, we see glimpses of God's grace. Just as my hope is, you can see glimpses of God's grace in your life, and I see glimpses of God's grace in my life. Second point that I would share from Moses's, just thinking about Moses, is that in Moses, we see, as Christians, a precursor and foreshadowing of Jesus' ministry. We see a precursor and a foreshadowing of Jesus' ministry. So in Jesus, who was a faithful Jew, we see someone who learned, and he was steeped in the teachings and the life of Moses. Jesus, in him, we see someone who embraced the legacy of Moses. As Christians, we see Jesus as the fulfillment and the consummation of God's promises to Abraham, to Moses, through all the Hebrew prophets. So we see this consummation in a couple of ways. Number one, in the law, 10 commandments, the larger law. Jesus says this, Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 and 18, he says that he came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. And then Jesus says, truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law. He's referring to the law of Moses, until all is accomplished. So Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. Again, that's Christian perspective here. Matthew chapter 22, Jesus, he's asked to identify, he's in a conversation, one of a lawyer, an expert in the law, challenges Jesus and asks Jesus to identify the greatest commandments of all. And I don't think he's asking Jesus to choose from the 10 commandments, but 600 plus commands. And Jesus responds by pointing to two. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, Jesus says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Both are, again, quotations. They are part of the law of Moses. And Jesus says, on these two commands depend all the law and the prophets. In other words, these are kind of the two biggies, the foundational commandments on which all the other commands and laws rest. Another example, John chapter 13, verses 30, 34 and 35. This is a little different way of presenting. Thank you. Jesus is in the upper room in John 13, and it's the final supper. And this is on the night before, well, it's on the night in which Jesus is going to be betrayed. It's the night before his death and crucifixion and death. And Jesus is with his disciples in the upper room. And he says, a new command I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also must love one another. And it's at this dinner that Jesus shows what love looks like by washing the feet of his disciples, which is usually a task reserved for the lowest of servants. And it's also here, again, we're reminded of what love looks like because Jesus washes the feet of all 12 disciples, including Peter, who Jesus knows will deny him in a few hours, including the feet of Judas, who Jesus knows will betray him in a few hours. Here's the point. The purpose and the foundation of the law Jesus would establish, of the law of Moses, is love. And we see then in Jesus showing us what love looks like, again, that it is sacrificial, unconditional, extravagant, scandalous. We also see, again, the precursor and foreshadowing of Jesus' ministry and this connection with Moses' story in the parallels between the deliverance stories in Moses' day and also in Jesus' day. So in Moses, we see this deliverance of Israel from slavery and bondage in Egypt. We see delivery of the Hebrews from the angel of death. And then we see this parallel in Jesus' ministry, deliverance from sin and death, deliverance from guilt and condemnation and shame. You know, in Moses' story and the story of the Exodus and other parts, we see, again, a sacrificial lamb whose blood covers the doorway of homes. We see this salvation from the angel of death. While the Hebrews are walking and wandering in the wilderness, we hear the story of the people being bitten by poisonous snakes. And we see the lifting up of a bronze snake, that if the people would look on this bronze snake, they would receive healing and new life. We see in Moses this leading of people from enslavement in Egypt to the promised land flowing with milk and honey, freedom. And there's, again, lots of parallels with Jesus, because in Jesus, Christians, we see Jesus as the sacrificial lamb whose blood washes away our sin, whose life saves us from eternal death. We see Jesus in a similar way. There's the comparison of the bronze snake, and we see Jesus being lifted up on the cross on Golgotha, on Calvary. And as we turn, as for Christians, as we turn to Jesus, we experience salvation from death and sin. Then, of course, we see in following Jesus, Jesus leading us, again, kind of like the enslavement from Egypt to the promised land. We see Jesus leading us from our enslavement to sin and death and hopelessness to the promised land, to eternal life. Last point that I would say is this. In Moses, we see God calling unlikely people to carry out God's purposes. In Moses, in his life, in his example, we see God who calls very, very unlikely people. Simply put, Moses is an unlikely hero. Like when you hear Moses' story, you think surely God wouldn't use someone like him. And yet God used someone who was meek and humble, impulsive and fearful, who was slow of speech and tongue, who had lots of problems, including family problems. And God used Moses to defeat Pharaoh, to free Israel, to offer the law, to lead people from slavery to sin and death, to freedom and hope and life. And I would say that in the same way, God calls unlikely people like me, and maybe like you too, to know and to share God's commandments, to love one another and to love our neighbor as ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Hong. Our final speaker is Imam Abdul Malik Ryan, who was born Michael P. Ryan in Chicago, Illinois. He is currently the Muslim chaplain at DePaul University in Chicago and also their assistant director of religious diversity and pastoral care. He's also worked as an attorney for children in the foster care system in Chicago for 10 years. Welcome, Imam Abdul Malik Ryan.
Assalamu alaikum, peace and blessings be upon all of you. It's certainly my honor to be with all of the attendees, with everyone who's coming on this Sunday to reflect upon Moses, or Musa alayhi salam, peace be upon him, and to be with my fellow panelists. And I really appreciated and benefited from their presentations, and I look forward to the discussion. As the other speakers have mentioned, I think, presenting on thinking of what to present with regard to Moses in a short period of time is itself a task, although it is good to think about what can you add or what can be brought that might be interesting or intriguing to the audience. First, I want to be clear that Moses in the Muslim tradition is a very important figure and very important prophet. One way of thinking of this is that Moses is considered one of the prophets who's ulul azm, who's one of the prophets of firm determination. So these are 5 prophets who are considered to be the greatest of prophets in a certain way. Another way to think about this is that Moses is mentioned more than any other prophet by name in the Quran. Moses is mentioned 136 times in the Quran, which is not that long of a book. And he actually, parts of his story or incidents relating to him occur in 35 out of the 114 surahs. So almost 1/3 of the chapters of the Quran have references to Moses, peace be upon him. And I think as a way of thinking about how the Quranic portrait of Moses relates to the pictures of Moses in the other faith traditions, one helpful thing to think about is scholars have spoken about why is Moses featured so prominently in the Quran? What is possibly some of the wisdom behind this? And also it's important to think about what is the nature of scripture and what is the nature of prophecy or being a prophet in our different traditions. I think, oftentimes in these interfaith discussions, I find, especially in Jewish Muslim discussions, let alone when Christians also come in, is that there's often a kind of contrast of how prophets are viewed. And Muslims are often thought to emphasize the sinlessness of prophets. So the majority view of Muslim scholars that prophets don't commit, at least for sure, major sins, and many scholars don't even think they commit minor sins. Of course, there's many references in the text to show prophets seeking forgiveness or thinking they didn't do the best thing, and scholars explain and understand these in different ways. But with regard to Musa, with regard to Moses, peace be upon him, I think one thing that's very beautiful is to think about when we think about Moses, even though there's this image, and I've never seen the 10 Commandments, but I certainly know what the image of Moses is in that movie. There is this image in the Muslim tradition that Moses is a very beautiful, physically strong person, and that comes out in a couple of the stories that we're going to talk about. But at the same time, I think the dominant motif that recurs over and over again in the particular stories that are mentioned with regard to Moses is, in fact, Moses's fear, Moses's feeling of insecurity. The fear, as Reverend Hong mentioned, starting from when he's a baby and his mother and people around him, that he lived a life constantly in fear. And when he's told to, when he's escaping from Pharaoh, when he's told he has to go back to Pharaoh, it's a life where constantly it's mentioned that he's fearful for his physical safety, as well as fearful that he is not up to the task. Muslim speakers often begin talks with this prayer that is attributed to Moses in the Quran, where he says, "My Lord, expand for me my chest and make easy for me my task, or ease for me my burden, and loosen the knot from my tongue and make it so that they understand me." And as is in the other traditions, Moses is understood in the Muslim tradition to have if a handicap, a speech impediment. And so this comes out when he's told that his task is to go back to speak to Pharaoh and to stand up for the children of Israel. And he has an element of fear that is in him. So I think what this brings out for me with regard to this issue of how we see prophets is putting aside the issue of whether prophets commit sins or make mistakes, which is a very interesting issue we can come to. But I think that Muslims certainly view all prophets as completely human, as human beings who have those fears, who have those insecurities, who have those emotions, who have everything that any human would have, and therefore they're able to serve. And this goes back to the purpose of why Moses is spoke about so often in the Quran, is he's not only able to serve as an example for the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which he is very much seen as an example for the Prophet Muhammad, as bearing many similarities in the task that he had for him, as being a prophet who brought a complete law, who brought what Muslims would call a Sharia, a way of life, a way of law for people to follow. He's as a person who has to be a kind of political leader over his people, who has to deal with the foibles and shortcomings of a people. And again, one of the other reasons that Moses' story is told so much is that the Bani Israel, the children of Israel, in the way that they acted after the Exodus, is seen as an example and containing many lessons for people to learn, for the followers of the Prophet Muhammad, as what it is to be a community and what it is to be a community that receives divine blessing and receives divine guidance, and what are some ways that you can honor that guidance, and what are some ways that you can maybe fall short in honoring that guidance. And Moses is there as someone who has to look over these people, and it has so many lessons for us. I love the point, and I won't go into as much detail as I intended because Reverend Hong did such a beautiful job, but I love the point of focusing on the women around Moses, peace be upon him. And in the Quranic version, one important thing to point out is that it mentions, when mentioning the mother of Moses, and I think it's such a beautiful idea to see that when the mother of Moses is doing something that may appear to be putting her child in danger, in fact, she is doing it completely out of love for the child. And the Quran says her heart was emptied out of everything else except her love for Moses. And in the Quran, she's doing it directly as a response to a command from God. And she's trusting and faithful in God that his promise is he will return Moses safely to her. And she lets him go, and God says that her heart was completely emptied of anything except love for Moses, and so much so that she was going to cry out and reveal the secret of where the baby was and who the baby was, except we strengthened her heart. And this is a lesson for all of us, that sometimes God strengthens our heart when it's empty. God strengthens our heart when we are able to do things that are difficult for us to do, and that even people from the outside may sometimes not understand, or even people involved may sometimes not understand. And I certainly found the reflection upon adoption to be very beautiful. But also, in addition, I like the point that Rabbi Belinsky made, that we don't often focus on Moses as a father and a wife, or the Jewish tradition doesn't as much. But I think it's interesting that there's so much focus on his family of origin, that Moses has Aaron as his brother, that Moses' mother and sister play such key roles. And this is a family that's such an interesting family that may have many lessons for us in terms of, as Reverend Hong alluded to, in terms of this idea of people who are between cultures, or people who have their feet in different cultures, people who are Americans, but who are also attached to places, to different peoples who may face difficulty from America or in America. And how do you, those people who sometimes feel caught between? There's a lot of lessons and inspiration from Moses as someone who could have felt at many points caught between. And finally, in the Quranic version, the woman from the household of Pharaoh who brings in Moses and calls for them to take care of him is called Asiya in the Muslim tradition, and is seen as one of the 4 women who perfected her faith. So seen of one of the greatest examples and role models and most faithful of women, even though she faced enormous hardship and persecution even within her own household. So I want to mention a couple other stories just from the Quran that come out that may not be the main things we think about, which are, the Exodus and the dialogue with Pharaoh and these other things, which are also contained in the Quran and spoke about at length. But Musa, when he's fleeing to Midian, when he's fleeing in fear, and in the Quranic accounts and descriptions, it said that he's completely hungry and he has no food but leaves of and vegetation that is around him. And his feet were such that they're described that they were about to fall off. And he's in complete desperation. And then the Quran says he arrived at waters by Midian, and he found there an ummah, a group, a large community of people watering their flocks at this water hole. And beside them, it says, and beside them he saw, and his attention went to these two women who had animals but were holding them back from the watering hole. And it's, I think, a beautiful lesson that the Quran draws our attention to, that Musa, at this lowest point of his, at this time when he's in immense fear and doesn't know where he's going to go or what he's going to rely upon, his attention is drawn in this scene to these two women who are on the margins, who are on the outside, who seem to be helpless. And he doesn't understand what is going on. So he comes up to them and he asks them, what is your story? What is the matter? Why are you here doing this? To get that information. And they tell him that their father is old and can't come to the watering hole. And the men at the watering hole do not allow them to water. They have no consideration for the weak and the vulnerable. And they just box them out and have everything for themselves. And Moses, this again is where his strength comes in the narrations. Moses either moves a large rock from the well that the men had put there, or he just moves the animals in and he waters them for the women. And then he simply turns away and he sits in the shade and he prays to God and says, my Lord, I'm in need of whatever good you can send me. I'm in need of whatever good you can send me. And of course, in the story, God answers his prayer, his supplication, by bringing one of the women back to him, even though he had asked them for no payment or nothing in return, and saying, we want you to come meet our father. And this ends up being the family that Moses marries into. I know time will go short, so I want to mention something beautiful. One of the most interesting stories in the Quran that Muslims spend a lot of time focusing on, because it's in the chapter of the cave, Surah Al-Kahf, which Muslims have a tradition of reading on every Friday. So every Friday, once a week, many Muslims read this surah and this part of the Quran, and it contains 4 stories. And one of the stories is the story of Moses and Khidr. And Khidr means the green one. Khidr is the one, you see, I'm wearing all green in honor of Khidr, but no. Khidr is the green one, which they say is because he had a blessing from God that he used to turn barren land green when he would go by it, because he had so many blessings. But in the story, Moses is said to have gotten up and given a most beautiful sermon. And he gave the sermon to the Bani Israel, to the children of Israel, and their hearts were open and their tears were falling. And he reminded them of God, how God had saved them and how God had delivered them. And one man asked, after this beautiful sermon, asked Moses, Moses, who is the most knowledgeable person on earth? And in the tradition, in the Muslim story that is related to us, Moses, he said, I am. And once we understand this, say not that Moses was being arrogant or anything, but Moses is admitting that this is Kalimullah. He's referred to by Muslims as Kalimullah, the one who spoke to God directly, the one. He was someone who, because he was honored by receiving this revelation, by receiving this law, because he had this communication with God, he's letting them know that I am the most knowledgeable because I have this direct communication from God and this messages that I'm giving you. And God is said to have revealed to Moses that you should go. You should not have spoken without knowing for sure. You should not have presumed to know that there's no one more knowledgeable than you. And in fact, there's someone named Khidr, who, this green one, he has knowledge that you don't have. And Moses, to show that it was not out of arrogance and his humility, he immediately says, God, I'm going to seek him out to find him, to learn what the knowledge that he has that I don't have. And God goes on this journey to find him, and he comes to him and finds him. And then there's many strange occurrences happen. And at the beginning, Khidr says, if you're going to accompany me, then you have to say you're going to be patient because you're going to witness things, but I don't know if you can be patient with me. And he promises he'll be patient. But Khidr says, you could never be patient. How could you ever be patient with things that your unknowledge cannot understand. And then you see these amazing events which are hard to understand. And even Khidr is doing things that appear to be wrong things, that appear to be harming people. And Moses can't take it. He can't be patient. And he complains about it. And then Khidr says, okay, you have to leave now because you were not able to be patient. But then he explains why he did each of the actions that he did. And many Muslims look at this as a beautiful rendering of the ways in which many things that happen in the world that we don't understand, that happen to us personally, or happen that we see happen to other people, that they have a wisdom, that God is in control, and they have a wisdom that we don't understand. And even though we take this comfort and we take this reassurance from that, at the same time, thank you, at the same time, one thing that you can reflect is that even when you get the explanations that Khidr gives, it just leads to more questions. It just leads to more things you don't understand. So in Khidr, in one of the incidents, he breaks the boat that belongs to these people. And then Moses doesn't understand, why did you break the boat? And he says that the ruler was coming along. A ruler was coming along and seizing boats from people. So by putting holes in this boat, I was able to, meaning the ruler won't take their boat, and then they can repair the boat and they'll still have it. But that explanation explains why Khidr did what he did, but it doesn't explain why are there rulers that take people's boats? Why are there these, why do horrendous things happen? Why are these things allowed to happen? So it just leads to more questions, but there's a feeling that and this is why Khidr said, how can you be patient with things your mind can never understand and never encompass? And that's the way of this world, that our faith in God has to go beyond thinking that we understand why things happen, because our understanding will never encompass the things that we see in front of us. I think when it comes to Khidr, one of the points that I want to mention is that the scholars split up into different camps of how to understand Khidr, and some focus on Khidr as this saint who has esoteric knowledge, this person who's hidden that people don't know about, but he has this esoteric knowledge from God that he can teach to people. And it forms, basis of the mystical tradition and a lot of Sufism in Islam. And for others, no, Khidr has to be a prophet. If anyone would have knowledge that a prophet doesn't have, Khidr was a prophet, and he was a prophet sent to another people, and Moses was able to benefit from him. I think in either case, it shows us that there's always wisdom out there outside of our own tradition, our own community. And one of the beautiful wisdoms of a gathering like Swift and an interfaith dialogue in general is that we can go to different people and seek different wisdom and different knowledge that they may have got from prophets that were sent to them, from their great spiritual teachers or saints, that we can then understand and benefit from. One of the beautiful things after the dua I mentioned about Moses, his next word was, send with me a helper, an assistant, Harun, Aaron, to share my burden. So in the Quranic story, it is Moses who asked God to send Aaron with him in order to speak to the Pharaoh, because he's concerned that his speech impediment and his other shortcomings will make Pharaoh reject him. And so in one story, Aisha, the wife of the Prophet Muhammad, she said some Bedouin were talking about what person did the greatest favor for his brother in history. And one man answered, it was Moses. He did a favor for Aaron, that he made a prayer. He supplicated to God to make him a prophet, and God made him a prophet. So some of the things that we can speak about are the thinking about Moses as a person with a disability, thinking about Moses as a person who had burdens, and how others were able to share those burdens with him. I wanted to just end with a story that's not really about Moses, although Moses featured in it, but it's a story about us as Moses. The story of Moses in the Quran contains lessons for us. And this story is not in the Quran. It's a story told in the Muslim tradition. And it is said, and I hope it'll be just a good ending, a beautiful ending for our reflections. And as we go into the question and answer, that it is said that there was a time when Moses was with Bani Israel in their wandering, and there was a drought that they experienced. There was a lack of rain, and that Moses called the people together to pray for rain, and that no rain came. And God revealed to Moses, there's a person amongst you that's such a great sinner that has been sinning for 40 years that we will not bring rain until that person makes repentance or separates himself from you. And so the person And the way the story is told is that person got so afraid. Imagine the person, he knows that his sin, that his not separating from the people is the cause of the rain not coming. And yet, if he separates from the people, they all know that he's been sinning for 40 years. And so, leaving with no choice, the person turns. But I imagine there might be many people in that gathering. If I said in this gathering that there's someone who's been sinning for many years and they're the cause of the hardships that the community is facing, I'm sure I would feel I was that person. So the person turns to God and says, "Oh God, please forgive me. Please shield me. Please cover my sins." And the rain begins to pour down. And then Moses says, "God, you said that we won't bring the rain until someone separates, but no one separated. Why did you bring the rain?" And God says, "Oh Moses, I only brought the rain out of the blessing of the repentance of this person." And Moses said, "Show the person to me so I can honor them for their beautiful repentance." And the man said, and God says, "Oh Moses, I covered his sins for 40 years. Do you think I will reveal him now that he's repented?" May Allah allow us all to repent and accept our sins, and may Allah us all to benefit from the beautiful examples of our prophet, as a prophet Moses, peace be upon him. Thank you.
Thank you, Imam Abdul Malik Ryan. I will turn this over to Ray now.
Thank you, Amy. We will now begin our question and answer session, and I'm going to turn this over to Leslie Carey. She is one of our co-chairs for SWIFT. We have three. There's a Christian co-chair, a Muslim co-chair, and a Jewish co-chair. So Amy, Leslie, let's go ahead and begin the questioning, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Good afternoon, panelists. I have some questions here that we've compiled. Some of them are for one of you. Some of them are for all of you. I will let you know which ones are which. So we're going to start off with a question just for the rabbi. And the question, and we've alluded to this, so you know what's coming. Moses likely is best known to non-Jews through his portrayal in big screen movies and even animated films. What is the biggest misconception that Hollywood has created about this hugely important historical figure?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've never seen, I never saw Charlton Heston and Moses.
Really?
Yeah. Not that it's okay to go see it. It's not a profound waste of time, but it's enjoyable and entertainment is legit. So I really haven't seen that. I don't know if, so I don't really know. I don't have a good answer for you, except I guess I would say as follows. The movie, I assume, is its own reading of the biblical text and supplemented by other parts, perhaps some rabbinic stories and other tradition stories, perhaps. I think part of that is because the biblical text itself is so sparing in many cases in the narrative that there's places to leave open for details. So we don't really know what Moses looked like, right, biblically. We don't really know what Abraham looked like. We don't know what Sarah looked like. We know Asaph had red hair. But the Bible itself doesn't seem to be concerned with that. Now, the fact that it's not concerned with it doesn't mean there isn't the impulse to then flesh out and more of the story. It's as if when you're reading the text is almost inviting you in to see its gaps, to see what it doesn't say, and invites you in and opens the possibilities of the range of meanings that one can take from it, and through legitimate readings. Have to be careful readings. It doesn't mean anything you want it to mean. But through careful readings, and you can begin to see some of that. So I'm avoiding your question, but I'm going to give one example of this. And that's as follows. And folks had mentioned it. about Moses being this in-between figure at times, right? How is he perceived? So in the book of Exodus, when Moses has grown up a bit in the palace, Moses at one point, it was after a certain period of time, and it says, Vayidal Moshe, Moshe grew, Vayetze el Echav, and he went out to his brothers, to his kinfolk. And then he saw an Egyptian man beating on a Hebrew slave, and Moses then ends up killing the Egyptian. Now, what's very striking about that verse is Moses goes out to his brothers, to his kinfolk, right? I would argue that from the verse you can see that Moses has a sense that he knows he's not an Egyptian. He knows who his kinfolk and who they are. Even though the reaction in the next story, when two Israelites are fighting with each other, they know, Moses is one of them, but they are very negative to him. Okay. Soon after this, when he runs away, Abdul Malik referred to this, when he runs away to someone who become his father-in-law, Jethro, Yitro, and this incident happens at the well. The biblical story may be a little different, and the rock piece is found in the Jacob story biblically, but something happens and he gets them out of the thrust of the shepherds, whatever version of the story. And the daughters go to their father and he says, well, how'd you get back so quickly? And they answer, an Egyptian man saved us. Now, so there you have it. He's being seen, looks like an Egyptian. So he's being seen as an Egyptian on one hand, but also from his own vantage point, he sees himself as an Israelite. Sure, he grew up in the Egyptian palace, but he sees himself an Israelite. But that continues throughout his whole career. And the example I gave of the golden calf story, God tells Moses, well, they're your people. So he has this identification with the people that God understands. I'm not sure the people ever fully understand that Moses is one of them. And again, Moses' great contribution there is to tell God, no, they're your people, and you can't simply dismiss them. So what Moses looks like, I don't really know. He didn't have horns, as the statue suggests. There were rays of light, it says, that emerged from him. But the Hebrew word keren here means rays, it doesn't mean horns. So you can imagine Moses how he looks as you want, because the biblical text really opens up, through its sort of terse narrative, it opens up possibilities that we want to know, and you can certainly fill in. So that was the short answer to your question.
Thank you. Thank you. Reverend Caleb, you have seen the movie. I could tell by your reaction. Briefly, what do you think is the biggest misconception of Hollywood for Moses?
I watched it only because my father was a big fan of Charlton Heston and John Wayne. That's the only reason, and I haven't seen it in decades. I'll go with Rabbi Michael's response. I'm not quite sure.
All right. This is for all three of you. There's a key moment in the history of Moses when some of his followers began to worship the golden calf. Rabbi Belinsky has mentioned that before God. What do each of your faith traditions view or fear as the golden calf in today's time? Who wants to start?
Well, I'll start.
Okay.
That's a great question. The movie question was a good question too. But that's, in other words, I mean, it's a great question, I think, because it forces us to take religious texts seriously and then attempt to translate them into contemporary times, not necessarily fully equating or identifying, but certainly using as something that can help us think about certain things. I guess the question becomes, how much do you invest in something material where it has the potential to become an object of worship, and contain a value that it does not? Okay, now I'm aware we all have, I won't say we all have, Judaism does, Christianity does, Islam maybe a little bit less, I'm not sure, so please fill me in. Sacred objects. And I'm not going, so a Torah scroll for Jews is a sacred object. It has to be treated in a certain way, etc. And even Jewish holiday coming up, we dance with the Torah scrolls as part of the celebration. But at what point can you put too much infinite worth in an object where it begins to become an act of worship and detracts from what is going to be key for how a religious / spiritual person, and religious in that broadest moral, sense that one can behave. And when does that object then begin determining what you're going to be doing, as opposed to how the object can be used for benefit? All right, you can take money in a simple way, right? You can use money. There's nothing wrong with living comfortably, but when it becomes an end in itself, you can use money charitably, you can use money to exploit people. But I think there's lots of other things as well. And I think it's a good category to reflect on.
Imam Ryan, you want to chime in?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question, and I mean a great question, and I think it may somewhat be different for different people. What they're drawn to or what's a challenge for them. I do think most people, would probably go towards the idea that materialism or money or is probably a dominant idol in the lives of many people, at least in our culture at this time. But science you could think of, and again, the point that Rabbi Belinsky made about money, it's not that science is a bad thing. Science is a wonderful, beautiful blessing, but turning anything into, the whole idea of idolatry is putting something at its wrong place. So it's not that something is bad, but just putting it as wrong place. So for Muslims especially, that could even refer to the best of creation, of prophets and of saints and stuff, but putting them in the wrong place and worshiping them or praying to them, that is seen as idolatry. So even investing things with even things that are beautiful and important with more importance than they should, which I think is a great challenge in our time, especially because many people have lost faith in the old understandings. Many people have lost faith maybe in a traditional understanding of God. And as I think I would agree with what many people kind of feel, for whatever reason, whether you think it was put in there by God or whether you think it came through evolution or some other things, but people still have this instinct or desire to want to worship something and to place something high. So it's going to find something to come to it. And we would say, as Muslims, anything that it finds other than God is going to be idolatry. So that is a great danger in our time, and for people who have lost that sense of who God is in their lives, that they could latch onto almost anything to kind of be that sense of purpose and meaning and
Right.
in their life. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Reverend Caleb, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think I really appreciate the presentations and this conversation, as well as the questions. I would agree with my colleagues here. In the Christian tradition, Jesus, well, anything can become an idol, right? But Jesus, he highlights the danger of mammon, which is like, money essentially, and again the materialism and the things that would consume us. But I think many other things, again the material things that whether it's money can buy or things that we just hold on to and put too much weight on. And I was thinking, when old church buildings become obstacles actually to ministry, or when we fight over the color of carpet, or certain traditions that we refuse to let go of just because we've always done it that way. So we do indeed have sacred objects within the Christian tradition as well. And I love the story the rabbi told of Moses. Again, 10 Commandments, how do you get holier than that? But my goodness, he broke them. But there was a time and place when we remember that everything other than God is not God. And so thank you for the question and just for this discussion so far.
This question is for Rabbi. In your faith, what is the significance of Moses freeing the Israelites from slavery? And what is the significance of the, and I've got this in quote, promised land?
Okay. From the significance from slavery is that the model it sets, as well as contained within the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, are numerous laws which are given a justification, numerous commandments that are given a justification or attached to because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. All right, don't you have to worry about the widow, the orphan, the stranger, right? You were because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So that the experience of the Exodus has to translate to extrapolate people's experience of liberation has to translate into an ethical qualities and results. It is not liberation for liberation's sake. There must be an ethical, moral engagement, ideal transformation, though it's really hard to be transformative, but at least engagement and understanding that one's experience of liberation, in this case, the exodus from Egypt, must result in a way of in mandating certain forms of behavior. In other words, that one's experience of liberation, one must learn something not only from being liberated, but also from the experience of slavery that can then translate into ethical, moral, even some of the spiritual categories once you've been liberated. So I think that becomes absolutely critical and crucial. And that's why there's numerous biblical laws, not all, but numerous commandments that have that justification of remembering the Exodus and the implications that one has to take with it. So that's on one level. The second level is something relating to that was raised about Moses's inability to speak. And you have some rabbinic stories about that, because the question is, why does Moses say, I can't speak? What happens? So some traditions may have it in more that's text, and you have this in rabbinic text, and there's sometimes some interesting parallels, but that's a separate question. But the one medieval mystical source, the Zohar, looks at the Exodus from Egypt and Moses's initial inability to speak. By the way, in the book of Deuteronomy, he speaks very well, right? So the question is, how does Moses gain this language? Are we talking about a physical impediment, or are we talking about almost a spiritual impediment? And the Zohar frames the act of liberation from Egypt as the act of the movement from slavery to speech. And that the slave is unable to speak. It doesn't mean they can't speak to each other, but the imposition that's upon the slave, upon the oppressed, who cannot speak freely, and the courage it takes to speak freely is part of the process of liberation, which then takes the Jews to Mount Sinai, where they are able to merge this sense of speech and language. In other words, Moses was in between. Moses could not formulate really language. Some suggest when the Zohar talks about Aaron joining with his brother Aaron, because Aaron was speech without words, Moses was words without speech. So it took two of them to put it together. But it really is a way of saying that the act of liberation from the Exodus from Egypt, one aspect of it is an act of liberation from silence to speech. And any time you give someone speech and allow them to be heard, you are taking them on a sort of exodus. Now, if you think about this metaphor from an educational point of view, that's what we want to do, but also from an oppressive point of view, from those who are oppressed, giving people the sense of speech, which Moses finally gains, and the people finally gain when they're redeemed, is something which is, I think, a powerful way to look at the Exodus. Indeed, if you look at the biblical text, and I think it's chapter 3 in the book of Exodus, it says when Pharaoh died, before a new Pharaoh comes, but when the Pharaoh died, the people groaned. All they could do was groan. They couldn't even talk about it. All they could do was let out a kretz, as we say, a real groan. But again, it's gaining the moment to Sinai, which is the moment of hearing God's voice, gaining voice, the people responding together that they're going to accept the covenant. It's when they gain voice, and giving people liberation is part of that process, is giving them a voice.
Excellent, excellent.
And the promised land, I'm not going to deal with. I think that's another topic that we can address at another time. It's too much to go on now.
Okay, great. Mom, Ryan, can you tell us what one lesson is that modern faithful people could learn from the story of Moses, or the stories of Moses? One lesson.
Okay, I will try. Let me see. I guess my mind is kind of where Rabbi Belinsky was. So I'll share. I think one thing that you really see from the Quranic story, one thing that's interesting that we kind of alluded to in the talks is that even whether Moses is seen as this, superhero figure, and literally, I think Moses is the kind of archetype for superheroes in American, comic books and kind of Superman and these kind of things. But he's seen as this kind of superhero figure. But he also his victory or his freeing of the children of Israel is not about physical strength. There's not a physical battle. He doesn't defeat them through that. They're as Rabbi Belinsky mentioned in talking about the Passover story. He shows the courage to go to Pharaoh and to proclaim the truth and to say that he should free the children of Israel. But they're then freed through actions of God, through the miraculous intervention of God. And I think there are lessons in even in how in the Quran Moses is told to go to Pharaoh and to speak to him kindly, that perhaps he could hear. So even though Pharaoh is the archetype of evil and oppression in the Quranic version, there's still this idea that you engage with it with a beautiful character and that you rely on God to deliver you from it. And there's also this ongoing thing, which I was going to say, is that in addition to this, I was really intrigued by this idea of moving to not being able to speak to being able to speak. But I do think there's also an idea that's stressed in the Quranic accounts and their commentaries, which talks about the ways in which living under oppression can serve to distort people's character and can serve to create certain habits of mind and action, which are difficult to deal with. And Moses, one of the lessons is how to deal with those kind of distortions of character, as Rabbi Belinsky mentioned beautifully, at times, defending the people to God, but also how do you work to reform the people or to help the people to come to a better place when they've learned these ways of acting that have been based on their need to survive in a certain environment. Now you want them to have a new environment and a new way of bringing. How can you bring out their noble character? So that's really the task of, and I think it's so, it's so interesting. If you look at even American history, that Moses is such an important history to so many figures throughout American history, especially when the Bible was more well known and where the Bible would be the most commonly referenced text in any political or cultural speech. They would especially focus on Moses, and everyone sees himself as Moses. So nobody sees himself as Pharaoh. So that's something to ponder upon as well. So both sides in the Civil War, the Pilgrims and the African Americans that were enslaved, all of these groups identify with Moses and the children of Israel. And it's a kind of a deep question to see, what do we do, or what would it mean if we see ourselves as Pharaoh, or maybe not as Pharaoh, but as the soldiers or the people who were supporting Pharaoh? What if we were to see ourselves as that at times, and what would we do in that situation?
Excellent, excellent. Reverend Caleb, is there a leadership quality of Moses that modern leaders could implement for us?
Yes.
Would you care to elaborate?
There's a lot, actually.
Just one.
Yeah, I think the thing that stands out, I think of Moses' call story, and again, just his encounter at the burning bush, and whereas I think there are maybe many leaders who would love to be in a position of power and authority and position and status and fame and fortune and all those things, Moses said, "I'll pass," in part because it was impossible. But I think, again, there's part of that being that he was meek and he was humble and he recognized his own limitations. And I think for leaders today, one of my prayers for our leaders today is that we would be humble and remember our limitations and our need for God, our need for others, to remember that we are not God, and that we rely on prayer, that we live with compassion. So the first word that comes to mind is humility.
Rabbi, what is the status, or what was the status? And you touched on this, so that was kind of prophetic in your own right. But what was the status of record keeping during Moses's lifetime? Were the things recorded in writing in some way, or were the stories transmitted mainly orally? Unmute yourself.
That was the best thing I said. There is a academic answer, and there is a traditional answer. I'll do the traditional. The academic question is perfectly legit, fascinating, and important, but I'm just not going to go into all the intricacies of that question now. Jewish tradition would claim that, although biblically it's a complex question, so I don't want to overstate it, that the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, tradition knows as written Torah, Torah Shebichtav, would be written down and maintained throughout, and that begins with Moses and Moses's time, and then continues throughout. Now, of course, there are certain problems with this because the book of Deuteronomy appears to be discovered, or quote unquote rediscovered later on. So that leads to all sorts of academic questions. But within the context and legitimate questions, So it's much more complex than what I'm saying. But within the context of Jewish tradition, the traditional response is that there was the 5 books of Moses, the book of the Torah, the Sefer Torah. It's written and continues to be written in every generation. There is even a mitzvah. There's a biblical command to write a scroll. The king had to have a scroll, according to the book of Deuteronomy. So that there's that tradition. The second tradition, which is, I'll say, much less apparent, but relatively easily understood, and you can see this within the Bible itself. The sense of Moses beginning to transmit, add to, and over generations continuing to do so to an oral rabbinic tradition that offers ways of interpreting the written biblical text. Because there are contradictions within the biblical text between different books, and it's very hard to read the Bible on its own without an interpretive community to make sense of it. Now, people are going to have their own interpretive communities, but for the rabbinic tradition, the interpretive community is understood as the oral tradition, which was transmitted orally, which gives it a sense of both authority and a certain amount of fluidity and openness, and that eventually, due to exigent historical situations, becomes written down and contained within the Talmud and a whole variety of other books, but on some level never fully written down. It still maintains this tradition of teacher and student. And I think that becomes the critical piece, that there's a sense in which there is a tradition that continues that is a teacher-student transmission tradition, and not just, if one could say that, specifically a written text. Now, that's a religious answer. It's not necessarily an academic answer, although within the Bible itself, you do see a tremendous amount of inner biblical exegesis, how texts read other texts and relate to other texts because of difficulties that are there.
Excellent, thank you. This next question is for Imam Ryan. Are there any beliefs about Moses by the Muslims that contradict the beliefs that Jews and Christians have about him, or do they line up about 100%?
I wouldn't say 100%, obviously. I think, and I think we may have both alluded to this, Reverend Hong and I alluded to this. One of the things whenever you tell these stories is, of course, Christians are going to see, Moses as kind of a pre-telling of Jesus, and Muslims are going to see at least the way his story is told, particularly in the Quran, as foreshadowing some elements of the Prophet Muhammad's life now, and saying that he was, foretelling that. Now, some of that is our belief about the Prophet Muhammad and Christians' belief about Jesus, but some of that also is the nature of the text. So the Quran has a certain purpose, and the Quran tells the story of Moses in a certain way. It was revealed, first off, although Muslims believe it is the speech of God, that it's not temporal, that it doesn't have a time, that it's eternal, but it was revealed in the first place to the Arabs around the Prophet Muhammad. So it would make sense that and the nature of the Quranic storytelling, which is very different from either the Old Testament or the New Testament, is as a sermon, is basically telling parts of different stories that all have lessons that the listener is supposed to take from them for their own environment. And so some of them were particularly for that environment that the Prophet Muhammad and his companions were in, and some of them, and many of them, are seen as universal because it is meant to be an eternal universal text. So and then, as Rabbi Belinsky alluded to, there are sometimes particular, but I would say in general, Moses is probably one of those figures where the story is most consistent between the three, partially because he's talked about so much in the Muslim tradition, as well as so it's as other figures, you may get a little glimpse in the Quran, which you have to do a lot more work to see how it compares or how it differs to the biblical story. In this case, there's a lot more in the Quran, and most of it you can see where it's coming from in the biblical story, even if it emphasizes different things, or as Rabbi Belinsky alluded to, maybe seems to be bringing in a different element of the story or some other story, or seems to draw on a particular midrash or something. That it's always very interesting to figure out, who that the Quran was in dialogue with. The Prophet Muhammad they're understood to be Jewish tribes in Medina that the Prophet Muhammad, as he was receiving revelation, was in dialogue with. But we have really no information outside of the Islamic sources, and even in those sources, very little information about what those Jewish tribes in Arabia believed, what texts they had access to. And this brings us to a bigger question, which is Muslims believe that the Torah was revealed to Moses, and Muslims believe that Jesus received revelation as well. But what that means and how those compare to the Torah as it's had today, and how the Injil, what we call it, compares to the Gospels that we have today, is a very deep and complex question. Even though some, especially with the Torah, some Muslim scholars have believed that the Torah, as Jews have it, is the Torah that was revealed to Moses, and maybe they don't interpret it the way that they should all the time, or there's difference of interpretation, but the actual text is the same. Some Muslim scholars have believed that. Other Muslim scholars have believed there was more change and distortion. But as Rabbi Belinsky was alluded to, what that invites a whole lot of questions about what we're referring to when we talk about the Torah, and what was the history, both religiously and outside of religious sources, of these texts. And so that's an interesting observation, though, to think about. And even during the life of the Prophet Muhammad, he would tell the Jewish tribes they came encounter with, he was inviting them to become Muslims, but if they wouldn't, he would constantly tell them, you should rule by the Torah, and criticize them when he didn't feel they were ruling by the Torah. And so what they had in front of them and what that meant is always an interesting question.
Interesting. We're kind of coming up on our hard stop here. So I'm going to ask two more questions, one for the rabbi and one for the Christian. Reverend, based on what you've heard the Muslim speaker say about Moses and his prophethood according to Islam, do you, one, personally believe that Muslims worship the same one God as Jews and Christians? And two, do you believe that your fellow Jews and fellow Christians all believe that we Muslims worship the same God as them?
What I would say is this. What I always love about our conversations together is, again, there's a representation by Jewish, Christian, Muslim speakers. I would also acknowledge, I think we all know that within our own traditions, there's a wide range. And sometimes even among Christians, you look at those who are, we have extremes in terms of theology, in terms of practice, in terms of interpretation. And sometimes even among Christians, I would say, are we worshiping the same God? So I would raise that just to point out what I think is, I hope, a humility that we have with each other. Are we? So the question is, are we worshiping the same God?
Personally believe that Muslims are worshiping the same one God as Jews and Christians.
I think so. Yes. And then what was the second question?
The second question was, do you believe that your fellow Jews and your fellow Christians all believe that we Muslims worship the same God as them?
So I think those on this conversation and those who are willing to engage, for the most part, we're open to that possibility. I think we live in a society that would tell us no, and that we are very, very different, and that we have a lot of reason to fight against and look down on each other. But I think that is, again, I think that's not helpful. It's also again, big picture for Christians would be this. What is it that we're commanded to do? Even when we're interpreting the Torah or the law or anything, the bottom line would be to treat one another with a spirit of love, offer humility, kindness. And so just with that in mind, with the spirit of love, are we worshiping the same God? Yes. I think I've said enough.
Rabbi, you want to chime in?
Sure. I think that we all we share. I think we share a lot, obviously, and I think we also have in certain areas certain different perceptions. Do I feel that when Christians are worshiping God, they are worshiping God? Yes. Can I go into do I feel comfortable going into a church and worshiping with a church liturgy? The answer would be no. But the bottom line, do certainly Christians identify as monotheists? Do Muslims identify as monotheists? Do Jews identify as monotheists? Absolutely. And no question. Are there certain perhaps differences between the traditions when it comes to certain understandings of God, how certain conceptions of God? Of course, there's going to be differences within the traditions, but do they bottom line share a sense of worship of the one God? The answer is yes, although we may have certain disagreements with each other about what are the parameters of one. But that doesn't change the perception, I think, of the Christian and Muslim and the Jew of the God they are worshiping. So when I see Muslims praying, yes, they're praying the name, I don't use the name Allah, but they're praying to God. I mean, I don't personally, not a perfectly good name, but they're praying to God. And I see Christians in church. Are they praying to God? For sure, they're praying to God. And hopefully Jews in synagogue are doing the same thing. Yeah, so for sure. Yeah. And then once we make that statement, then we can go into the different nuances and issues that may arise, and that would be fine. And there's a long history to that and changes that have certainly happened over time within our traditions.
Thank you. Imam, would you like to wrap a little bow around this for us so that we can wrap this up? We're heading up against our deadline.
Thank you. No, yes, I of course, I completely agree with my co-panelists. And I think that, on the one hand, you can say that, and I think this is what Rabbi Belinsky is alluding to as well. On the one hand, you can just say, look, for those of us who believe there's only one God, if someone's worshiping God, they're worshiping the same God. There's no other God to worship. Again, depending on what someone means by only one God. Some people could mean there's only God that we worship, but there are other gods out there, or other people have other. But we believe the universe was created by one God. And so anyone who's worshiping that one God who created the universe is worshiping the same God. If they have now, it's then even easier for us to speak for, especially as Muslims, among Jews and Christians, where we share so much of the same tradition, where our book, the revelation that we currently read refers to the Jews and the Christians as the people of the book, and through our law makes clear that we're to understand them as people who worship the same God and come out of the same tradition. So certainly for Muslims, it is our understanding. Putting aside other groups, which could be a longer conversation, but I think we would still find a lot in the idea of that there's only one God for all humanity, but especially among Muslims, Jews, and Christians, which, as we usually call it, the Abrahamic faith. But after today, I'm going to start calling it the Mosaic faith. So inshallah, that could be even more appropriate. As Abraham, I think we have even more difference about, and we know less about, but certainly Moses is someone we all share greatly in common.
I like that little bit of a change. Thank you. Thank you so much, panelists. It's been a wonderful afternoon spending with you. This time, learned so much. So on behalf of SWIFT Thank you very much to our panelists. Also, on behalf of SWIFT, thank you so much for our attendees. We appreciate you taking time out of your day to listen to this topic. I think we all can say we've learned at least one little tidbit for the afternoon. And I hope you've enjoyed this fascinating discussion. If you would like to be able to see this again, we will be putting it up on SWIFT's YouTube channel. It has been recorded. So in case you missed it or wanted to see something again or refer your friends to it, it will be up on our YouTube channel. I invite you to follow us on Facebook and also to check in with us on our website. We don't have anything publicly or scheduled for the public for the rest of the year. We could get inspired between now and December 31st, but I'm not going to guarantee anything. But do keep us, do check in with us on a periodic basis. If you are on our general email blast, if anything comes up on a public basis, we will let you know. So please enjoy the rest of your day, everybody, panelists, attendees, and thank you very much, and may God bless us all.